Hi class, chapter 11, and for the digital copy, it is page 83. Monday came. There was no sign of Toby as the boys and I walked to school. It was raining lightly and threatening more and blowing cold, but I still hoped to see him on a hilltop, just to know he hadn't left. Perhaps I would go down to his shack after school, not to bother him, just to see if I could spy him sheltering there out of the rain, though he walked in all weathers and seasons and would likely do so today, too. First, though, I would go to school. My parents always told me that school was my most important job. I knew with my two brothers that I would never farm this land, and I wanted and had to grow up an educated woman. Today I would learn some arithmetic, no doubt, and a few state capitals, why we fought the wars we did, what Anne of Green Gables would get up to next, and why I shouldn't mix bleach with ammonia. But first on my list was what Andy had to say. My parents had told me to stay away from Betty, but they had not told me to avoid Andy. He was a bully for sure, but I meant to ask him about the belfry and the taut wire across the path. Toby had said they make scratches on the turtle stone, and I wondered if he meant Betty and Andy, if that was where they'd sharpen the wire they had cut James. I pictured one of them on each side of the turtle stone, the ends of the wire wrapped around the stick handle so they could pull it to and fro like a two-man saw, honing it sharp. What I couldn't fathom was how they had thought to do that, or why they'd actually done the thing. Even a wolf had reasons for what it does. Even a snake makes sense when it eats a robin's egg. By the time we got to the schoolhouse, it was raining in earnest. We had worn oilcloth ponchos, hoods up, and boots, so we were plenty dry and warm, but many of the other children came in soaked and shivering. For the first time that season, Mrs. Taylor lit a fire in the stove at the front of the room and gave the wettest of her students a chance to dry out before lessons began. "Goodness, what happened to you?" she asked James, bending low to look at the bandage on his forehead. When James glanced my way, I shook my head. "Pirates," he said. Mrs. Taylor nodded. "I thought so." She returned to the front of the room. "Those of you who aren't too wet, come on up here," she called. And so my brothers and I went forward, a few others too, and I wondered what she had in mind for such a mixed bunch. Not state capitals, as it turned out. "I want to talk to you about what happened to Ruth," she said, glancing at the door. I turned to look, but it was shut and no one had come in. I realized then that both Andy and Betty were absent again. I wasn't surprised about Andy. On such a rainy day, he would be forgiven many of his chores at home, so why bother with school? Betty, I thought, might be at this moment leading the charge against Toby. I pictured her practicing both prim and proper, aiming for innocent and probably succeeding with those who didn't know her. Annabelle? I turned back to Mrs. Taylor. The other children were looking at me. "I asked you how you were doing. I'm sure it wasn't easy to see Ruth get hurt like that." "It wasn't," I said, "but I'm okay." She talked for a little while about the importance of trusting people, telling them about the things that bothered us. "If any of you saw Toby on that hillside, or anyone else for that matter, or anything odd that day, you should tell someone. Me, your parents, Reverend Kennel, someone who can help you do the right thing." I raised my hand. "Who told you that Toby was on the hillside?" "I heard about it at church yesterday," she said, "from the Glengarrys." I thought about that for a moment. "So you know that Betty is the one saying Toby threw that rock?" Mrs. Taylor nodded. "Yes, I heard that." "Then can I please go up to the belfry so I can see what there is to see out that window?" To which Mrs. Taylor, clearly baffled, said, "Why would you want to do that?" "Because Betty said she was in the belfry with Andy at recess when she saw Toby through the window on the hillside." Mrs. Taylor said very slowly, "Betty claims they were up there the day Ruth got hurt?" I nodded. The other children listened to all this more attentively than they had ever listened during their lessons. Mrs. Taylor stood up, went to the door at the back of the room. It didn't open when she tried it. She came back to us, then, deep in thought. "All right," she said. "Go on back to your seats. Read the assignments I've written on the chalkboard." She joined the children drying out around the stove. From my desk, I could hear her telling them to trust people, to tell the truth. While I read about the Spanish-American War, I listened for the door to open, for Betty to walk in, but she didn't. It was still raining at recess, so we stayed inside and played marbles and cat's cradle. Before calling us back to our lessons, Mrs. Taylor had us do a long series of jumping jacks. "To make you strong," she said, though I knew what that afternoon would be like if the boys, especially, didn't wear themselves out a little first. As we were returning to our desks, the door finally opened, but it was Andy who came in, not Betty. He tipped off his hood and shook all over like a dog as he looked around the schoolhouse. "Where's Betty?" he said. When no one answered him, he said more loudly, "Mrs. Taylor, where's Betty?" She turned from the chalkboard. "I have no idea, Andy. She didn't come to school this morning. I wonder if she might be sick." Andy pulled his hood back up over his head, left without another word. Mrs. Taylor stood where she was, looking long at where he'd been. "Settle down, everyone," she finally said. "Time for lessons." At the end of the day, as my brothers were putting on their rain boots, Mrs. Taylor took me aside and said, "I'd like to come see your parents after supper time, Annabelle. Do you think that would be all right?" I was startled by the very idea of it. Did I do something wrong? Or my brothers? "Oh, no, Annabelle, nothing like that. I just want to talk to your parents for a few minutes." Well, then sure," I said. I didn't want to be rude, but I was curious. "Do you have a telephone at your house, Mrs. Taylor?" "I do. Why?" "Because we do too." I hoped I didn't sound fresh. You could just call them up if you want." Mrs. Taylor gave me a little smile. "I could, but..." She paused to choose her words. "Well, I'm sure you know that Mrs. Gribble is sometimes a little curious when she puts a call through." Ah. Andy Gribble lived in a small house that we passed on our way to the market. I'd only been there once to drop off a bushel of peaches at canning time, but she'd invited us in for a glass of lemonade that my father made, and I'd been fascinated by the switchboard that dominated her front room like a loom strung with thin black snakes. I'm going to just pause for a minute to explain. Back during this time, people would have to plug in a cord for a phone to go through a telephone switchboard, and one telephone operator would usually run this. So it sounds like it was Mrs. Gribble. So whenever she'd plug in that connection for a call to go through, she'd sometimes listen through, and then she'd take, if she could learn any gossip, she would take it and maybe call someone and tell her friends. So that's why she didn't want to call on the phone. Okay, back to where we are. Mrs. Gribble, or she sat there all day long and made connections between the families in our hills that had acquired telephones. To use ours, we had to ring up Annie and tell her where to place the call. And she had a habit of listening in to hear the news that she thought other people really ought to know. We were used to the idea by now. Nobody dared tell a secret over the telephone for fear that Annie was eavesdropping. But Annie made hay out of even small things, so we'd learned to start a conversation with the most boring of our news, hoping that she'd be more easily distracted by another customer calling in for a connection. Whatever Mrs. Taylor wanted to talk about, it wasn't meant for Annie's ears. "Do you want me to tell you, or do you want me to tell them you're coming by?" I said. "I would appreciate it," Mrs. Taylor said. I pulled on my boots, and I tried to tie the laces of James's hood under his chin, but he tossed his head like a young horse and galloped out of the school into the rain before I could do a proper job. Henry followed him, and they both did a mud dance across the sloppy schoolyard before gaining drier ground in the woods. I was not in the mood to walk home alone in the cold and wet, but I saw no alternative until Mrs. Taylor called me back. "Annabelle, I could come for a visit now if you think that would be all right, and you could ride home with me." I'd rarely had a chance to ride in a car as nice as hers, but importantly, it would be warm and dry. "I imagine my father will be at the house or close by on a day like this," I said, "and I'm sure my mother will be there, so now would be okay, I guess." I followed her to the car and climbed into the back seat, feeling a little like a queen until I realized that I was sitting where Ruth had been. It was a slow and careful ride to the farm, the roads awash in some places, but we got there without mishap. "You go on in and make sure it's a good time for a visit," Mrs. Taylor said, "and I'll wait here." So I did that, and my mother hurried past me to open the door and beckon Miss Taylor to come inside. "Mrs. Taylor, come in, please," my mother said in her Sunday voice. She called most people by their Christian names, but not the minister, the doctor, the constable, or the teacher. "Thank you," Mrs. Taylor said, trying to shed as much rainwater from her bonnet as she could before she stepped inside. "Oh, don't fuss about that," my mother said. "You'll be the only one who did. Annabelle," she said to me before I could take off my poncho, "run to the barn and fetch your father." So back outside I went and laughed out loud when I saw my brothers pull up short at the sight of me as they slithered down the muddy lane. "Mrs. Taylor gave me a ride in her car," I yelled at them, laughing still, headed for the barn. Our old barn taught me one of the most important lessons I was ever to learn, that the extraordinary can live in the simplest things. Every season meant a world refashioned inside its stalls and storerooms. Pockets of warmth in winter, the milk cows and draft horses like furnaces, their heat banked by straw bedding and new manure. In spring, swallows fledged from muddy nests wedged in crannies overhead. The kittens, fresh and soft, staggered between hooves and attacked the tails of tackle hanging from stable pegs. Come summer, yellow jackets nested in the straw, old oats sprouted through the floorboards. Houdini hens laid eggs in odd places where they might yield chicks, and dusty sunlight striped the air like bridges to somewhere else. But I loved the barn in fall, especially when I'd often find my father there, mending wagon wheels, oiling the joints of wagon parts, and sometimes, as on that November day, napping in the hayloft, snoring softly in the dim blue light. "Mrs. Taylor is here to see you," I said softly into his ear while the rain thrummed on the tin roof just above our heads and the horses stamped for their oats below us. "Wake up!" My father roused suddenly from continents away. "What?" he said, sitting up in the hay. "Mrs. Taylor is here to see you," I repeated. I sat back on my heels. "You have straw in your hair." He pawed it away. I plucked off a stubborn bit, and we both rose and climbed down the hayloft ladder. My father cleared his throat and shaking the sleep from his head. I was just having a rest," he said as we walked abreast down the dim stairs into the stable below. He ran his hands through his hair. "Mrs. Taylor, you say?" "She wants to talk with you and Mother." He looked at me sharply. "What did James do?" "Nothing. Henry neither. I don't know what it's about, but I think it had something to do with Betty." My father sighed as he pulled his hood up over his head. "I've had about my fill of all that," he said. and walked straight out into the hard rain. By the time we pulled off our boots and hung up our wet ponchos, my mother had made coffee and put some oatmeal cookies on a plate. Mrs. Taylor was waiting for us in the front room, perched on the edge of a chair, her hands folded as if we had bad news for her. I was afraid it would be the other way around. "I'm not sure Annabelle needs to be a part of this," she said hesitantly once we were all seated. "Well, I'm not sure what this is," my mother said, "but if it has anything to do with what happened to Ruth, she really ought to hear. She's been right in the middle of that mess from the start." Mrs. Taylor nodded. "If you think it's all right." She spent a moment, quietly, unfocused, and then she looked up and said, "I understand that Betty claims she was in the belfry looking out the window when she saw Toby throw the rock that hit Ruth." My father nodded. "That's what she says. Only that can't be right." Mrs. Taylor sighed. "A few days before Ruth got hurt, I caught Betty and Andy up in the belfry at recess. I shooed them out, and then I locked the door that leads to the belfry stairs. It was still locked today when I tried it, and I have the one only key right here." She patted her pocketbook. "One more lie," my mother said quietly. "One more big lie," I said, trailing off as everyone turned to look at me. "What? It's true. Betty didn't see Toby do a thing. Betty's a bully. She's just mad at him because he told her to leave me alone." My father took my hand. That's all right, Annabelle. You aren't wrong. Betty had that lie already on her tongue because she'd been up in the belfry before and knew just what to say." Mrs. Taylor sighed. That does seem to fit. "Would you please go tell that to Constable Alaska?" I said. Remember, the constable is like the sheriff. She nodded. "I will," she said. "But I wanted to come see you first. The Glengarrys are my friends, and I didn't want to make an accusation without talking it out first." "No accusation about it," my father said. "Just information. The constable will do with it what he can." For days I'd been feeling as tense as a banjo string, twanging every time some new problem arose. But there were also moments of relief, like this one. Finally, maybe people were beginning to understand what kind of person Betty really was. Mrs. Taylor stood up, and we with her. "Betty didn't come to school today. I imagine she's home sick. Perhaps I should go by and speak with the Glengarrys first, before I see the constable." My mother shook her head. "We've been in your shoes, and lately it won't do any good. They are set on the idea that Betty has done nothing wrong." Mrs. Taylor nodded. "I expect you're right about that. Betty's an odd girl, but she's their granddaughter." She didn't talk about the rest of it, how badly she had bullied me, how I suspected she and Andy had hurt James, but the lid was off. The worms were rearing their slick little heads, and they'd soon be spilling out with their mucky secrets. I can't say I was glad, exactly, but I wasn't sorry.